On the wall in my grandmother's house was a print of the Last Supper of Christ painted by Leonardo da Vinci. And I remember sleeping on that couch under this picture, and I would drift off to sleep with Jesus and the disciples as I would hear the chimes of the grandfather clock throughout the night. That painting might be familiar to you. There is Jesus seated there right in the middle of the table with 12 disciples spread out to the left and the right. And he has a red robe with a blue sash. It seems that if you paint Jesus, he needs to wear a sash. And don't ask me about why everyone sat on the same side of the table. But there is Jesus in the middle. And he is serene and calm amidst the busyness of the disciples that surround him. And there's also another painting of Jesus in my grandmother's house. It took a few years for me, though, to realize that it wasn't a portrait of one of my relatives. I mean, who can blame me? This Jesus seemed to fit in so well with the 70s vibe with his long hair and his beard. This famous image of Jesus was painted by Warner Sallman, titled The Head of Christ. And I have since seen that painting in numerous churches and homes. And this image, this picture and painting of Christ is so ubiquitous. When people think about how Christ looks, this image might come to mind. I suppose one reason it is so well liked is that some people see a hidden image of the Eucharistic host wafer in the forehead of Jesus and then a wine chalice there at his temple. Most images of Christ that I come upon in art seem to depict Jesus as calm and nurturing. Whether the artist is trying to depict the crucifixion to whether the artist is trying to depict the child Jesus, they all seem to center on a Jesus who always is calm and serene, compassionate and humble. Art has an impact in how we see the world and how we see Jesus. And artists have pushed the boundaries of how we traditionally view Jesus for centuries. And they push against our narratives about how we should think about Jesus. And they try to push us out of our comfort zones, showing us things we might have never seen or thought about before. And there's another image of Jesus that's been making the rounds on social media. It is one of those AI-generated pictures of Jesus flipping over tables in the temple. And he is a long-haired, bearded Jesus wearing a cream robe with a sash. Always the sash. AI thought that Jesus should be flipping over the tables, but not in the way we would normally think. What I mean is that AI-generated Jesus was doing a backflip over the tables in the temple. Who would have thought that we would ever get acrobatic Jesus doing a backflip over a table? This is a very different picture of Jesus than I grew up with. Today's gospel reading has that same feeling. The Jesus that we see in John's gospel is different than the Jesus I grew up with. As Jesus enters Jerusalem, it's time for the Passover feast to be celebrated. The hearts and the minds of the people are being focused on the Exodus event and the expectations of deliverance. Jesus, a faithful Jew, comes to the temple, a sacred place, the dwelling of God on earth. The temple was a magnificent sight. A sight to behold, as Herod the Great had begun a massive restoration and expansion of the temple 40-some years ago, and the project was still underway when Jesus entered that day. What a sight it must have been. But appearances can be deceiving. Entering the table, Jesus found little in the way of sacred space. The court of the Gentiles, that outermost part of the temple, looked and sounded like an open-air market. The sounds of livestock are in the air. The cattle are bellowing. Sheep are bleating. The turtle doves are cooing, people yelling and bartering and haggling, and the coins are clanging. The thing here is that all this activity was necessary for the functioning of the temple. The temple tax had to be paid in temple coins, so the money changers were necessary. The sacrificial animals had to be without blemish, so they were needed to be brought to the temple and bought there. After all, who could make it all the way to Jerusalem with an unblemished animal? Not a scratch or a bruise. All this activity was in service of the temple, but did those services have to be rendered inside the temple grounds? Was it necessary to rob the Gentiles of the one area in the temple where they were allowed to enter and pray? And Jesus looks around. He knows that all these things here are to fulfill a function, but they are getting in the way. The court of the Gentiles had been taken over by the buyers and the sellers. And he fashions a whip, and he clears the temple courts of the animals and flips over the tables of the money changers. And as he moves through the market, he creates holy havoc. Imagine the scene. Tables turned over, animals squealing and running wildly, coins bouncing along the ground, turtle doves flapping their wings. Take these things out of here. Stop making my Father's house a marketplace. Jesus is flipping tables. Jesus is driving the animals. Jesus is challenging the status quo. I grew up with the saying, WWJD. What would Jesus do? Well, how often did we think flipping tables was a possible answer to that question? This Jesus is a Jesus that I'm not so sure I like. This Jesus is a Jesus that goes against the grain. This story of a wild, untamed, and undomesticated Jesus pushes against my narrative of this calm and serene Jesus. The Jesus loves me so because the Bible tells me so Jesus is the Jesus that I like. That Jesus I like. I prefer a tame and domesticated Jesus, as if that was ever a thing. But this Jesus, John's Jesus, the one that flips the tables over, is a Jesus that I'm not sure I want anywhere near my comfortable suburban life. We don't like it when our views of Jesus get challenged. It puts us on edge when we have to think about Jesus not fitting into nice little boxes. We take Jesus, the one we like, we just plop him there in a box. There you go, Jesus. Stay in that nice little box there. Stay there because I've got you all figured out. Stay in that box, Jesus. I got my life figured out. And Jesus, you might have something to say about somebody else's finances, but mine? Mine are just fine. Stay in that box, Jesus. You might have something to say about other people's calendars, but my calendar, my family's calendar, they're just fine, Jesus. Stay in that box, Jesus. And Jesus, you might have something to say about politics, but by golly there, Jesus, I'm doing just fine as it is, and just stay in your lane over there, Jesus. And dare I say that we like a Jesus who is sanitized and domesticated. We like a Jesus who is predictable and doesn't flip over tables in our own lives. In what ways do we domesticate Jesus in our lives? In what areas of our lives, what areas are off limits? to Jesus. And after Jesus clears the temple courts, the people are asking him, by what authority has he done all of this? What gives you the right to flip over these tables? What gives you the right to clear out these animals? And they ask, what sign can you show us to prove that you have the authority to do this? The people just don't understand. And Jesus continues his blistering critique. You destroy this temple. You destroy it. Jesus doesn't say that he's going to destroy the temple. Jesus doesn't say he's going to just tear down the temple. And if there is any destruction of the temple, it isn't Jesus that will be doing the destruction. Jesus tells them, you destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. And the people assume that Jesus is referring to this magnificent temple that Herod was building. The idea that Jesus might rebuild that temple is ludicrous at worst and laughable at best. The people misunderstood Jesus. People misunderstand Jesus to this very day. The temple Jesus was speaking of was his own body that will be broken upon the cross and raised again in 3 days. The people will try to destroy him, but the efforts will be in vain. Not even the tomb can hold him, and he will be raised again in 3 days. Raised from the dead. And only with the cross in the rearview mirror do the disciples finally understand that Jesus was telling them that day when he clears the temple courts. Only from the far side of the cross do the disciples finally understand Jesus, that Jesus will not allow anything to get in his way as he gathers the whole world to himself. Jesus will flip the tables that represent all the things that stand in Jesus' way in our lives. For Peter, it was an encounter by a fire on the side of a lake. Feed my sheep. His table is flipped. For Thomas, it was a visit in a room, and my Lord and my God, as he falls to his knees and his table is flipped. For Paul, it was an encounter on the road to Damascus. Why do you persecute me? And his table is flipped. What tables need to be flipped over in our own lives? Those tables that were set up to help us. Tables that once served a purpose, but now they are in the way of Jesus as we try to follow after Jesus. We all have them. Those misplaced allegiances, those religious presumptions, the pathetic excuses, that smug self-satisfaction, the spiritual complacency, the nationalistic zeal, the political idolatry. The economic greed in the name of God are only some of the tables that Jesus would overturn today. We like domesticated Jesus. We like safe Jesus. We can understand that Jesus. And Jesus disrupts everything that makes religion safe and cozy. Jesus never once said, "Understand me." He says something far more radical. Follow me. In C.S. Lewis's book, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, he reminds us that the meaning of Jesus is neither tidy nor tame, but that it is nonetheless one that we can embrace with confidence. So Susan and Lucy are asking Mr. and Mrs. Beaver to describe Aslan, and Aslan is C.S. Lewis's representation of Jesus. and they ask if Aslan is a man. And Mr. Beaver replies, Aslan, a man? Certainly not. I tell you, he is the king of the wood and the son of the great emperor beyond the sea. Don't you know who is the king of the beast? Aslan is a lion, the great lion. Oh, said Susan, I thought he'd be a man. Is he quite safe? I shall feel rather nervous about meeting a lion. That you will, dearie, and make no mistake, said Mrs. Beaver. If there's anyone who can appear before Aslan without their knees knocking, they're either braver than most or else just silly. Then he isn't safe, said Lucy. Safe? Said Mr. Beaver. Don't you hear what Mrs. Beaver tells you? Who said anything about being safe? Of course he isn't safe. But he's good. He's the king, I tell you. Amen.